The alarm blared at 03:47 Greenwich Mean Time, and Secretary-General Amara Osei was already on her feet before the second pulse cut through the air of her subterranean cabin. It wasn't just any alarm. It was Code Iris, a sequence of tones she had helped create 18 years ago at a planetary security conference in Geneva, and which had never, in her entire career, been activated outside of simulations. 3 descending notes, a pause, then 2 ascending. The sound that meant they have arrived. She already knew, of course. Deep space surveillance satellites had detected the gravitational anomalies 40 minutes earlier. Perturbations in the heliomagnetic field near Jupiter's outer orbits, of the kind that physicists at the Astronomical Intelligence Agency called translation scars. The traces that warp drives left when objects of extraordinary mass exited hyperspace. Amara donned her steel-gray uniform with methodical movements. 47 years old, gray hair cut short, eyes that had learned not to betray what they calculated. She walked down the polished Titanite corridor of Bunker Alpha, 2 levels beneath the streets of London, and didn't say a single word to the escort officer who joined her at the corner. There would be time for words later. The central coordination room was a semicircle of holographic screens and analysis consoles that projected bluish light onto the faces of 32 specialists. Most had arrived in the last 20 minutes, summoned by the same alarm. Some still carried coffees they hadn't had time to finish. General Raymond Okafor, head of the Unified General Staff, was the first to speak when she entered. 208 high-mass vessels, estimated displacement between 800 meters and 2.5 kilometers each, positioned in an orbital blockade formation at 32 degrees ecliptic inclination at a distance of approximately 570 million kilometers from the Sun. He paused. Some are larger than our moon. Amara positioned herself before the central screen, where a gravitational rendering showed the mass signatures as golden points against the black backdrop of the outer system. They were many, and they were enormous. "Communication?" she asked. The signal engineer, a young woman named Priya Nair, nodded. "We received a structured transmission 18 minutes ago. Unknown compression format. But our adaptive translation systems have managed to reconstruct approximately 92% of the content with over 70% confidence." Priya hesitated. "Secretary General, it's an ultimatum." "Play it." The voice that filled the room was not human, but it had been processed by the agency's state-of-the-art universal translators in a way that made it sound like a low-range, flat voice without recognizable emotional inflection. A voice that conveyed not anger but something worse, absolute indifference. Inhabitants of the stellar system cataloged as NGC Sol 3. You are identified as a pre-emergent species, Stage 4 classification, confined to a single habitable planet with no confirmed interstellar warfare capability. The Eternal Empire of Ketharak officially notifies this system that, as of this transmission, you have 30 local planetary cycles to formalize total surrender. Surrender implies complete transfer of administrative control, inventory of all biological and mineral resources, and immediate integration under the Standard Assimilation Protocol. Non-compliance will result in neutralization of the inhabited object. This message admits no response. End of transmission. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Admiral Joseph Kowalski, commander of the Orbital Defense Fleet, said in a low voice, "Neutralization of the inhabited object. They're talking about destroying Earth." "I understood the part that interests me," Amara said. She turned to the side screen where an analyst was overlaying the detected energy signatures over a database of known technologies. "We've had 14 months of surveillance on them. Since the beginning of the gravitational anomalies in the Oort cloud," confirmed Intelligence Director Nikolai Vasquez. "They watched us. We watched them watching." "And what did they see?" Vasquez opened a file. "Electromagnetic radio and television transmissions leaking into space since the 20th century. urban heat patterns consistent with primitive industrialization, 2 manned missions to the moon and a modest orbital station, a satellite sent beyond the solar system over 140 years ago. He closed the file. The image of a species still arguing among themselves over geographical borders and whose greatest feat in space engineering is an 18-segment telescope. What they didn't see, Amara said, and it wasn't a question. What they didn't see, Vasquez confirmed, with something that almost amounted to a smile. Amara walked to the central table and activated the restricted access compartment. The screen that opened required dual biometric authentication, confirmed by her and General Okafor simultaneously. What appeared made some of the younger analysts hold their breath, even those who already knew what was there. It was a map, not of the solar system as astronomy books described it, but as it truly was, seen through the eyes of those who had spent 60 years building in absolute secrecy. The far side of the moon glowed with 7 sets of structures, each covered by electromagnetic dispersion fields so precise that they absorbed even zodiacal light in a way that created no detectable silhouettes. The shipyards, each capable of housing and building medium and large warships powered by compact fusion reactors, buried 2 kilometers beneath the lunar surface. And then there were the other points, 14 of them, scattered across stellar systems at distances of 4 to 32 light-years from Earth, accessible by warp technology that humanity had developed in absolute institutional silence over 3 decades. They saw what we wanted them to see, Amara said. A primitive species in dispute with itself, an easy target. She turned off the screen and looked at the people around the table. Now we will show them what we chose to hide. Admiral Kowalski crossed his arms. Commander Chen is positioned with Response Group 1 in Martian orbit. 180 line ships. Do we request authorization to activate hostile first contact protocols? Not yet, Amara said. First, we send a response. They said they admitted no response. I know what they said. She turned to Priya. Prepare a wide-spectrum transmission, encoded in their same format. Content, moon location coordinates, active video channel. She paused. And someone get me the access code to the live feed of the lunar shipyards. External cameras. I want them to see what's out there waiting for them. Priya worked for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then she looked up. Ready to send. Send. The transmission traveled at the speed of light and reached the Imperial ships 46 minutes later. On the communications systems of the flagship Kethvara, the main screen displayed something that Admiral Graven Sethk-Ur, veteran of 117 assimilation campaigns in 62 stellar systems, had never received from a pre-emergent species. A response. And within it, images. Colossal structures beneath the surface of a natural satellite. Warships arrayed in rows that stretched beyond the camera's limits. A force that did not appear in any of the surveillance data from the past 14 months. Graven Sethk-Ur stared at the screen for a long moment. Analysis, he ordered his intelligence officer. Admiral, the images present inconsistencies with documented technological patterns. The constructive capability displayed would be impossible for a species at stage 4 emergence. Our initial assessment is that it is a digital forgery. Graven considered this. 14 months of surveillance showed a species still warring with missiles and chemical fuels. This was impossible. It had to be a bluff. It had to be. Maintain the deadline, he said. 30 days. If it's a bluff, we'll see it in the field. In Bunker Alpha, Secretary General Amara Osei received the intercepted Imperial communications analysis and read their response report carefully. Then she said, to no one in particular, in a voice that carried decades of patience built on a foundation of unwavering certainty, they think it's a bluff. Good. Let them think so for another 29 days. And for the first time in hours, she took a sip of the coffee that had grown cold on her desk, and the entire room saw something that rarely appeared on Secretary General Amara Osei's face. A small, almost imperceptible, but absolutely real smile. Outside, at 32 degrees ecliptic inclination, 208 ships of a 12,000-year-old civilization awaited the surrender of a species that had learned, throughout its turbulent, bloody, and extraordinary history, one thing above all others: never show all its cards at once. The countdown had begun. The Human Orbital Defense Fleet No. 1 had no official name. Staff documents called it Priority Response Group, designation Alpha Martian, but the engineers who had spent years building its ships deep within the moon called it something else, in whispers that traveled from shift to shift like an oral tradition. The Dentition. Commander Yuki Chen knew this. She had heard the nickname when she was still a lieutenant, almost 19 years ago, and had liked the image ever since. Teeth were not the flashiest part of a living creature. You didn't see them unless the creature opened its mouth, but when it did, you immediately understood the nature of the thing before you. Yuki was in the command center of the flagship Southern Cross, a 1,200-meter-long dreadnought whose silhouette resembled a gigantic fishhook, designed specifically to baffle the visual analysis patterns of hostile sensors. Around her, 179 other warships orbited in a dispersed formation around Mars, within the electromagnetic interference field generated by Phantom Station, buried beneath the surface of Phobos. They were invisible to Imperial long-range sensors, or at least she bet on it. 30 days from initial transmission, said her tactical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Balogun Adeyemi. 18 have passed. They haven't moved. They're waiting, Yuki said. Calculating. Calculating what? We already sent the shipyard images. Calculating whether they believe us. She rose from her command seat and walked to the observation window overlooking the reddish Martian space. Think like them. You've spent 12,000 years subjugating civilizations. Every time you arrived in a new system, the local species either surrendered or was destroyed. You never encountered serious resistance from anyone below Stage 6 technological emergence. Oh, she touched the glass with her fingertips. And suddenly, a Stage 4 species answers your ultimatum with a video of a war fleet? What do you do? Adeyemi thought for a moment. I suppose I'd try to find out if it's real. Exactly. And how do you do that? By sending scouts, reconnaissance ships. Yuki nodded. We tracked 3 small ships that separated from the main formation on the 12th day. Speed and movement pattern consistent with high-speed reconnaissance probes. They went to lunar orbit, made a full pass, and returned. And what they saw depended on which route they took. Yuki smiled slightly. The moon's engineers know very well which approach angles activate the camouflage reflectors. The probes saw exactly what we planned for them to see. Adeyemi paused. You're saying we let them do reconnaissance on purpose? I'm saying their reconnaissance confirmed our story. Yuki turned away from the window and returned to the command center. But not all of it. They know about the lunar shipyards now. They don't know about what's hidden beyond Neptune. On the 10th day following the transmission, intelligence analysts in Bunker Alpha confirmed what Yuki already suspected. The Imperial fleet was moving. Not all 208 ships. About 16 remained in the rear, in a gravitational blockade position. The rest advanced in a conical formation, bow pointed towards the inner system, increasing speed consistent with a combat approach. Deadline expired 2 days earlier than expected, Adeyemi reported. They lost patience. Or gained enough confidence, Yuki said. Same result. Activate dispersion protocols. All ships to Omega maneuver pattern. The Omega maneuver pattern was something that had never been used in real combat outside of simulations, but had been developed over 15 years by a group of strategists who had studied not galactic military doctrine, which humanity barely knew, but its own history. Guerrilla warfare, decentralization, asymmetric engagement, multi-layered electronic interference. The human fleet had spent 18 years perfecting the principle that a smaller force should never behave, as a smaller force was expected to behave according to the enemy's rules. When Imperial sensors located the 180 heat and energy signatures in Martian space, Admiral Graven Seth-Ur ordered the classic arc formation: line ships in front, support cruisers on the flanks, bombing reserve in the rear. It was the formation with which the Empire had won 317 space battles in the last 4 centuries. What happened next was not in any Imperial manual. The 180 human ships dispersed simultaneously in 180 different directions. Not in retreat, not in a fugitive pattern, but in divergent attack vectors calculated to create the maximum possible angular coverage. At the same time, each ship activated its broadband electromagnetic interference system, a technology developed by Chief Engineer Maria Santos specifically to saturate the targeting systems of unknown technology. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If you don't know how the enemy's sensor works, you don't hack it. You suffocate it. "Active jamming readings," reported the Imperial sensor officer. "Unidentified type. Our targeting systems have lost 68% tracking accuracy." Graven looked at the screen with something very few creatures had managed to put on his face in 117 campaigns: genuine confusion. "Reconfigure systems for passive heat scan," he ordered. But the human ships had anticipated this too. Each unit carried thermal dissipation panels that could, for short periods, reduce its heat signature to values close to the cosmic background. Not perfect invisibility, but enough to turn 180 clear targets into 180 intermittent ghosts that appeared and disappeared on sensors. On the flagship Southern Cross, Yuki monitored everything through a low-emission communication system developed to operate below the detection threshold of most known listening technologies. Squadron 6, Vector 127, Delta Group, take advantage of Deimos's gravitational shadowing window. All groups, fire at will only upon confirmation of trajectory solution. The battle, from an external point of view, seemed like chaos. From a human point of view, it was an orchestra. Imperial line ships, accustomed to dealing with fleets that lined up in formation and exchanged broadsides at predictable angles, found themselves chasing ghosts in 3 dimensions, while electronic interference distorted their internal communication systems. When they managed a target lock on a human ship, the ship simply wasn't there anymore. It had executed a 90-degree vector change at an acceleration that the Imperials would consider impossible for a ship of its size, thanks to the state-of-the-art inertial compensation systems installed in each human unit. Graven lost 43 ships in the first 4 hours. He had never lost more than 7 in an entire battle. "Impossible," murmured his first officer. "A pre-emergent species cannot have this tactical doctrine. A species that spent 10,000 years warring only against itself," Graven said slowly, and something in his voice changed as he began to understand. "Learns to fight in ways no one else has learned, because no one else needed to." He looked at the screen. "We are not fighting a newly emergent species. We are fighting war specialists who never had to follow our rules. But understanding is not the same as knowing what to do about it." Graven did the only thing his training suggested when conventional tactics failed: escalation. He ordered the Varus 7, the heavy artillery dreadnought at the center of his formation, to prepare the planar rupture cannon, a weapon designed to create space-time shockwaves that destroyed any ship within an 8,000-kilometer radius, regardless of armor or shields. Yuki received the Varus 7's energy charging readout 2 minutes and 40 seconds before the shot. She had planned for this, too. "Spine team," she said into the communicator. 18-minute window. Execute." Spine team was composed of 9 extreme-speed ships, each crewed by volunteers who had signed a high-risk form describing the operation as having a probability of return less than 40%. They were the fastest ships in the human fleet, built on the principle that speed was the only armor that mattered. They accelerated in a needle formation directly towards the Varus 7, using the weapon's own energy-charging signature as a navigation guide. The electromagnetic interference they generated, concentrated in a single vector, was enough to blind the Varus 7's targeting systems at the critical moment. The planar rupture cannon fired and missed. In space, the shockwave created a spherical dead zone that destroyed 4 nearby Imperial ships and disabled 11 others. The Varus 7, without the fine control needed for precision firing, had delivered the first and only blow of the battle to the Empire itself. 7 of the 9 Spine Team ships returned. Graven was silent for 32 seconds, staring at the damage report. "Order withdrawal to the outer system," he finally said. The battle had lasted 11 hours and 42 minutes. The Empire had lost 71 ships. Humanity had lost 2. And as the last Imperial ships accelerated towards Jupiter, Yuki Chen's transmission reached them, clear and undistorted. "The 180 ships you just encountered were our first dentition. We kept the others in reserve for you." A calculated pause. "Count well when you leave our system." In Bunker Alpha, Amara Osei watched the battle replay and, when it finished, said only one thing to General Okafor. "Phase 2. Open the hidden diplomatic channels. It's time to make friends." The transmission arrived encoded in 3 layers of encryption, traveling through relay nodes planted in erratic asteroids along a route that took 18 hours to complete, designed specifically to be impossible to track in real time. The recipient was Deputy Ambassador Lena Vasilyeva, who occupied a windowless office on level 7 of Bunker Alpha, and who, technically, worked for the Department of Extrasolar Behavioral Pattern Statistical Analysis, a designation so terrifyingly boring that it ensured no one ever asked questions about what she actually did. What she actually did was monitor intercepted communication signals from the Eternal Empire of Ketharak for 11 years, learning 3 subsidiary Imperial languages in the process, and building, with the patience of an archaeologist excavating layer by layer, a map of all the species the Empire had subjugated and that still maintained some capacity for internal communication. The message that arrived that morning came from a relay point around the 5th planet of the Tau Ceti system. She decrypted it personally because the 3 other people with access to the decryption protocol were still asleep. The message read, "In Kithara 4th, the bureaucratic dialect the Empire used for communications with assimilated species, we heard what happened near the Red Planet. We are the Velhari. We have been listening for a long time. Can you speak?" Lena stared at the text for 45 seconds. Then she activated the internal Red Alert protocol and sent a 6-word message to Secretary General Amara Osei. "First indirect contact confirmed. We need to talk." The meeting 2 hours later included Amara, Lena, General Okafor, and Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, a xenolinguist specializing in non-human communication systems who had developed humanity's first adaptive translation protocols. There were 4 people in a room designed for 8, and the 4 empty seats seemed heavy with unspoken weight. "The Velhari," Lena said, standing before a star map projected on the wall, "are an amphibious species originating from a system 43 light-years from Earth. Their civilization had approximately 8,000 years of development when the Empire assimilated them about 300 years ago. Based on the interceptions I've made over 11 years, they maintained a clandestine communication network within Imperial systems." She pointed to 3 dots on the map. "They are not alone. There are at least 2 other species with similar networks that communicate with the Velhari, the Korathi, who were stellar navigators before assimilation, and the Mireth San, whom the Empire uses as specialized engineering labor." "And they all heard about what happened on Mars," Amara said. "Across Imperial space, news spreads much faster than the Empire would like." Lena closed the map. "A Stage 4 species humiliated an assimilation fleet. For the subjugated species, that's like someone screaming from a mountaintop that the Emperor is not invincible." Dr. Al-Rashid interjected, "The communication problem is serious. The Velhari use a communication system based on low-frequency acoustic pressure variations. What they consider standard language has components below the human auditory spectrum. We can read the Keth Ara 4th transcripts they use for bureaucratic communication, but direct communication will require weeks of calibration." "We don't have weeks," Okafor said. "Analysts estimate the Empire will take 30 to 50 days to reorganize and send a second fleet. And this time, it won't be 200 ships." "I know," Amara said. "But the Velhari have already initiated contact. They made the hardest move." She looked at Lena. "What do they want?" The message was a question, not a proposal, but if I interpreted the cultural subtext correctly. Lena hesitated. "They want to know if we are just another power that will use and abandon them, or if we are something different." Amara was silent for a moment. "And what are we?" "That," Lena said, "is exactly what I needed you to tell me." The Secretary General's response took 4 hours to draft. Not because Amara was slow, but because every word had been deliberately chosen, revised, and chosen again. Lena supervised the translation into Keth Ara 4th, while Dr. Al-Rashid developed an acoustic frequency compression protocol that the Velhari could eventually interpret with their native systems. The message sent was not a treaty, not a proposal for alliance, not an offer of weaponry. It was a question back in 3 parts. What do you need to survive now? What did you dream of having before? What would you have built if you had had time? Lena had argued that the questions were too risky, that they seemed diplomatically naive. Amara had responded that that was exactly why they would work. A species that has been enslaved for 300 years doesn't need another powerful entity telling them what it will give them, Amara had said. It needs someone who asks what they want. The Velhari's response arrived in 48 hours, considerably faster than the transmission protocol should allow. This suggested, Lena said while deciphering the routing relay, that the Velhari already had the channel prepared, that they had already anticipated that someone eventually would ask exactly this kind of question. The answer was long, too long for what had been asked. The Velhari had sent not just an answer, but a story. 300 years of history, compressed into text, sent to a species that didn't even know of their existence a month ago, because sometimes containment disappears when someone finally asks. Dr. Al-Rashid stayed awake for 36 hours translating. When she finished, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady as she read the summary to the assembled room. Before assimilation, the Velhari had developed a planetary ocean terraforming system. They could transform dry, rocky worlds into fertile aquatic biomes in less than 200 years. The Empire destroyed all technical records of this system and uses the Velhari to operate underwater mineral extraction equipment on ice asteroids, because that is the only technical capability the Empire finds useful in them. Fatima paused. They want their oceans back, not theirs. They know their homeworld was altered too much to reverse. They want a new ocean somewhere, a beginning. The room fell silent. General Okafor, who had spent 40 years of his life on military strategy matters, said in a low voice, "And we have worlds that could use exactly that terraforming process." "There's a planet in Tau Cetiae," Lena said, consulting her files. 22% surface water coverage. Currently uninhabitable for humans due to excessive salinity and absence of a stable nitrogen atmosphere. With the Velhari's ocean terraforming technology, they build a world. We learn how to do it. Amara completed the sentence. And the Empire loses 300 years of specialized slavery all at once. It was not at this meeting that the agreement was finalized. It took another 3 weeks, back and forth transmissions, a trust protocol gradually established through increasingly specific information exchanges, and the progressive involvement of the Korathi and the Mireth San. The Korathi, who knew the Imperial fleet patrol routes by heart after 300 years of navigating under Imperial orders, offered something no human intelligence could have bought: complete and updated maps of the Empire's naval movement patterns. The Mireth San offered something even more valuable. During their assimilation, they had been forced to build and maintain the deflection field generators for the shields of the largest Imperial ships. They knew every weak point, every failure sequence, every recalibration parameter that made the shields temporarily vulnerable. In return, humanity offered what it had promised: not salvation, not permanent protection from a new, kinder master. It offered choice. It offered information. It offered resources for these species to build their own survival capabilities as the conflict with the Empire unfolded. And crucially, it offered something the Empire had systematically destroyed in every species it subjugated: a voice in the planning of the battle to come. "The problem with empires," Amara said in one of the transmissions to the Velhari, whose translation took 2 days to verify, "is that they build power by treating others as tools. We won't win by being a better empire. We will win by being the thing the Empire never understood was possible." "And what is that?" asked the Velhari representative. "An alliance where each party is strong enough not to need the other, but chooses to be here anyway." There was a significant technical problem that no diplomacy solved. The allied species were scattered within Imperial space, thousands of light years apart. Their ships under Imperial control, their communication systems monitored. How to coordinate a resistance movement across stellar distances without the Empire noticing? The answer came from a 28-year-old engineer named Takoda Morningstar, who had spent the last 6 years developing what he called a gravitational anchoring communication system, based on the fact that subquantum level perturbations in specific mass bodies could be detected in real time across arbitrary distances without detectable electromagnetic emission. In simpler words, he had found a way to use the stars themselves as nodes in a communication network that was physically invisible to any electromagnetism-based sensor because it used no electromagnetism at all. The Empire had monitored every photon of electromagnetic emission in the systems it controlled for millennia. It had never thought of monitoring the Song of the Stars. When Morningstar's system was verified and replicated for the Allies, and when the first coordinated message traveled simultaneously to the Velhari in Tau Ceti, to the Korathi in Kepler 442, and to the Mireth San in HD 4307, Dr. Al-Rashid looked at the reception confirmation data and said, in a voice slightly trembling at the edges, "They all responded in sync, all 3 at the same time." "What did they say?" Lena asked. Fatima read the translation on the screen and then looked up. "They said, 'We are ready. When do we start?'" On the other side of the solar system, in an orbit 3 astronomical units beyond Uranus, the ships of the frontier fleets began to emerge from their hiding places for the first time in 60 years, awakening from a long sleep with engines slowly warming and crews looking at the stars for the first time without the obligation to remain hidden. The second Imperial fleet was 26 days away. The human response was finally complete. The eternal Emperor of Ketharak had ruled for 432 years, which meant he had seen more wars than most species lasted as civilizations. His birth name had been forgotten centuries ago. The office had become the person, and the person had become the embodiment of 12,000 years of uninterrupted Imperial dominion. He sat on the throne of convergence when the report from the Battle of Mars was delivered by the Imperial messenger who had traversed 42 stellar systems to reach him. The report lasted 72 minutes in compressed audiovisual format. The Emperor watched it without moving, without expressing visible emotion, for the entire duration. When it finished, he remained silent for another 4 minutes. Then he said, "What is the species' name?" "Humans. Eternal. They call themselves in multiple languages, but the most common term in their public transmissions is humans, or a regional variation of the same word." "And Admiral Seth-Ur, where is he?" "Awaiting public judgment in the Hall of Errors Eternal." The Emperor considered this. Graven Seth-Kur had been the best admiral of his generation, an assessment the Emperor gave sparingly, for the word best implied comparison, and comparisons implied limits. The fact that the best admiral of his generation had lost over 70 ships to a single system species, classified as pre-emergent, was not merely a military defeat. It was a statement about the nature of humans that the Emperor could not ignore. "Rehabilitate Admiral Seth-Kur," he said, to the messenger's visible surprise. "Not because he succeeded, but because I need someone who has looked directly at this species to tell me what they truly are." The Crusade fleet was mobilized in 16 days, a record for an operation of this scale. 2,000 ships. Not just dreadnoughts and line cruisers, but electronic suppression ships, orbital precision bombardment ships, transport ships with 20,000 Imperial soldiers in hibernation compartments, and, crucially, 3 ships of a type the Empire rarely employed. The observers, equipped with recently developed multi-spectrum sensors capable of detecting even subliminal gravitational perturbations. Admiral Seth-Kur, rehabilitated but marked by the experience, traveled as a consultant on the flagship of Grand Warlord Thethys Vor, a 2.5-meter-tall creature whose species had evolved on double-gravity worlds and who, consequently, had never developed the biological concept of fatigue as humans understood it. Thethys Vor did not sleep. He planned. "You said they fought in unexpected ways," Thethys Vor said, 3 days after departure, studying the Battle of Mars records for the 12th time. "Explain unexpected." Graven chose his words carefully. "Any species we encounter eventually develops a combat doctrine, a structure, patterns that reflect their psychology, their biology, their conception of hierarchy and sacrifice. Humans have doctrine, but they seem capable of discarding it completely in real time when the situation changes." Tactical improvisation. More than that. It's as if each individual commander operates with a complete understanding of the objective, but total freedom to choose the path. They are not robots following an algorithm, and they are not chaos. They are. Graven paused. "They are like water. You cannot push water into a corner because it finds another path." Thethys Vor processed this. "And the reserve ships the human commander mentioned, the ones that didn't fight. We have not located any mass concentration in the inner system consistent with a significant scale reserve fleet. Long-range sensors found dispersed energy signatures throughout the asteroid belt and beyond, but nothing cohesive enough to be interpreted as intentional formation." "Camouflage," Thethys Vor said. "Possibly. Or psychological deterrence. Humans may have bluffed about reserves to create uncertainty." Graven hesitated. "Or they may not have bluffed. That's the problem. On Earth, the intelligence analysts monitoring intercepted Imperial communications had names for the important members of the Crusade fleet before it was halfway there. Amara studied Thethys Vor's profiles with the same attention she had given to Admiral Seth-Kur, looking for patterns, points of predictability, and, crucially, inflection points that could lead not just to a military defeat, but to a diplomatic opening. "Thethys Vor is smarter than Seth-Kur," said Lena Vasilieva, who had spent the last weeks translating internal Imperial communications. "And more pragmatic. There are communications here that suggest he is not entirely in favor of this campaign." "Why?" "Because he was the one who submitted the initial report to the Emperor about the Battle of Mars, and his report was more accurate and more concerning than the official reports." Lena opened the file. He wrote, "Recommend full investigation before further military action. Indicators suggest humans may have undetected capabilities of significant scale." The Emperor ignored the recommendation. "So Thethys Vor is heading into a battle he thinks he might lose," Amara said, "or that he might avoid if he finds another way out." Amara sat with that idea for a long moment. Then she said, "Open a direct channel to the Imperial flagship." Not through the relay system. Direct open transmission in Cathara first, the Emperor's formal language. That will reveal our long-range communication capability, General Okafor warned. They already know we have long-range communication capability. What they don't know is that we understand Cathara first. Amara looked at him. I want Thethys Vor to know we're listening, and that we're talking to someone within his fleet who could benefit from an alternative to battle. The channel was established. The message was sent, and for 48 hours, there was no response. On the 19th day after the Crusade fleet's departure, the Imperial observers began to detect something that caused the sensor officer of each one of them to report simultaneously to Thethys Vor's flagship. Regular masses of moderate displacement, detected via subliminal gravitational perturbation, beginning to converge from multiple vectors beyond the target system. Thethys Vor studied the compiled report. The masses were too small to be moons, too large to be natural asteroids, and the word regular was what caught his attention. Shape, density, spacing, all regular, all constructed. How many? He asked. Estimate still updating. Grand Warlord. Minimum confirmed number, 840. Maximum potential number. The officer paused. Our detection capability is saturating. Gravan Sethka upon hearing the number, closed his eyes for a moment. They didn't bluff, he said in a low voice. It was at that moment that the transmission arrived. Direct, no relay, in flawless, accentless, Cathara first. Grand Warlord Thethys Vor, I am Secretary General Amara Osei of United Humanity. I know you read the report on Mars before your superiors. I know you made a recommendation that was ignored. I also know that you are now seeing what we see, that this battle does not need to happen. A pause. You have 48 hours to respond, not because it is an ultimatum, because after that, our allied ships begin to exit hyperspace, and conversations become more complicated when there are 4,000 ships on both sides in the same system. On the Imperial flagship, silence lasted 8 seconds. How do they know my name? Said the communications officer. How do they know Cathara first? Said the tactical strategist. How do they know about the report? Said the first officer. Thethys Vor said only, leave me alone for an hour. He used the hour to read, for the 13th time, the Battle of Mars records, and this time, he didn't look for tactical weaknesses. He looked for something different. He looked for what had led a species to build an army in secret for 60 years, communicate with enslaved species of his empire without him knowing, and yet, at the moment of overwhelming power, send a diplomatic message instead of simply attacking. A species that could have won and chose to ask first. At the end of the hour, he called the communications officer. Prepare a response on the same channel, in Cathara first. What should I transmit, Grand Warlord? Thethys Vor looked at the stars outside the observation window, the same stars he had navigated for 140 years of Imperial service, which had always seemed immutably ordered under the structure of the Eternal Empire. And for the first time in 140 years, he was not sure that the Eternal Empire was an immutable fact of the universe. Transmit. Secretary General Osei, I received your message. I have questions. May I ask them? On the other side of the solar system, Amara Osei read the response and took a deep breath through her nose, slowly, controlled. The kind of breath she had learned 30 years ago was the antidote to the risk of letting relief come too soon. Respond. All questions are welcome. She turned to Lena. And now we begin the hardest phase. The battle? Lena asked. No, the conversation. The conversation between Amara Osei and Thethys Vor lasted 22 hours, spread over 2 days of back-and-forth transmissions, while the Crusade fleet continued its advance at reduced speed, and while the human frontier fleet ships continued to emerge from their hiding places beyond Neptune. It was not a peace negotiation. It was, as Lena Vasilyeva had described it to General Okafor, a mutual deposition on the nature of what each side truly was and what each side truly wanted. Tethys Vor asked 37 distinct questions throughout the transmissions. Some were tactical. Why did human ships use broadband interference instead of targeted jamming? Others were philosophical. Why had a species that had built destruction capability on a galactic scale dedicated decades to diplomacy with species it didn't even know were potential allies, instead of simply building more ships? Amara answered all of them, some with data, some with uncomfortable honesty. Because the second option would make us exactly what we are fighting, and if we did that, then why would we care about the outcome? The Grand Warlord took 44 minutes to respond to the last question. But the conversation wasn't the only thing happening. In the asteroid belt, the human fleet had positioned itself not in a combat formation, but in something that Imperial strategists had never seen before, a network. 600 ships distributed in such a wide volume of space that it covered the entire inner range of the belt, each ship at a sufficient distance to operate independently, but connected to the others by Morningstar's gravitational communication system. There was no flank because there was no line. There was no core to be destroyed because each node was replaceable. It was, in the words of Commander Yuki Chen during the planning briefing 3 weeks earlier, the difference between a spider's web and a brick wall. You can push a brick wall down, but a spider's web absorbs the impact and still catches what hit it. The allies, the Velhari, the Korathi, and the Mireth San, were distributed within the human fleet, not in separate blocks, but integrated into each squadron. The decision had been the result of a long discussion that began when the Velhari representative asked, with the tentativeness of one unaccustomed to having an opinion taken seriously, "Where do we position ourselves?" And Yuki had simply said, "Wherever you want. Which part of the plan makes sense for you to take on?" The Korathi had chosen the role of flank navigators because they knew the Imperial movement patterns like no one else. The Mireth San had asked to be positioned adjacent to the heaviest Imperial line ships because they knew the exact shield parameters and could calculate vulnerability windows in real time. The Velhari, whose low-frequency acoustic communication technology worked astonishingly effectively as sonar in debris fields, took on the role of early detection in the chaotic asteroid belt environment. None of them had been trained by humanity. They had 300 years of suppressed internal capability, waiting for someone to ask how they wanted to use it. On the 11th day of the Crusade fleet's advance, Tethys Vor asked what to external observers seemed an innocent technical question. Your allied ships, those of previously assimilated species, do they operate with modified Imperial technology or native technology? Amara immediately realized what he was really asking. It wasn't about technology. "Native," she replied. "Developed and operated by themselves, with resources we made available but do not control. They do not work for us. They work for the same reason we do, because they chose to." There was a long pause. Then Tethys Vor said, "I need time to think." "Take what you need," Amara said, and resisted the temptation to add anything. The time he took was 12 hours, and during those 12 hours, while the Imperial fleet maintained stable speed and internal communications between Imperial admirals indicated heated discussions that human interceptors could not fully translate because they used a coded dialect exclusive to the military caste, something different was happening in the asteroid belt. Systems engineer Keiko Watanabe, aboard the human technical support ship Osaka, was working on one of the many makeshift solutions that had become, throughout the Battle of Mars, the unofficial specialty of human fleet maintenance. The deflection field system of the Korathi ship First Voice had suffered an overload during the reactivation process after decades of Imperial suppression, and the native Korathi control systems were incompatible with humanity's standard diagnostic protocols. Keiko had spent 4 hours conversing, via automatic translation with frustrating latency, with the Karathi chief engineer about how the system worked natively, before concluding that the solution was not to convert the Karathi system to human protocols, but to create a translation interface that allowed the two systems to speak to each other without either needing to change. When the first voice's deflection field returned to normal operation, the Karathi chief engineer, whose species expressed gratitude through a series of appendage movements that the automatic translator described only as gesture of significant debt recognition, spent 20 minutes performing these gestures towards Keiko, and then asked, through the translator, "How did you know we could solve it together without either yielding?" Keiko thought for a moment. Because each system was designed to solve a real problem. Two systems that solve real problems can almost always speak to each other if you find the language they both understand. The Karathi engineer was silent for a moment and then said something that the translator processed as, "That is very similar to what we say about different peoples." Keiko smiled. "It's exactly what it is." On the 20th day, Thethys Vor transmitted his response to Amara. It wasn't a response to the last question, specifically. It was a proposal. "I have 32 fleet commanders who agree with me. This battle is unnecessary and unwinnable. I have 116 who believe the opposite. I have orders from the Eternal Emperor that leave me no operational choice but to advance." A pause. "But you need to understand that I have no authority to do what you are suggesting unless there is a demonstration that alters the calculation of the 116. "What kind of demonstration?" Amara asked. "One that shows what we face without destroying my entire command in the process." Amara understood. She turned to General Okafor. "Activate the frontier fleets. All of them. Active signal emission, visible positioning, no disguise." Okafor hesitated for only a second. "That reveals everything we have." "No, it reveals enough for Thethys Vor's argument to carry weight." She looked at him. "We no longer need secrecy. We need them to see the truth." What the Crusade Fleet's sensors registered in the next 6 hours was, in the words of the flagship's sensor officer, the most unusual detection event of my 80-year career. From all vectors around the solar system, from positions spread across a volume of space ranging from the Kuiper Belt to the inner orbits, ships began to appear. Not in groups, in fleets. Fleets that had been built in silence in 14 stellar systems over 60 years, that had waited motionless and dark for decades, that now activated engines and communication systems and sensors simultaneously, as if a single signal had awakened them all at once. The final count, when the Imperial Observer's sensors finished cataloging, was 3,240 human ships, plus the 1,000 allied ships from the 3 species, plus the 600 already positioned in the belt. 4,840 ships, in positions that enveloped the 2,000-ship Crusade fleet from all possible angles. None of them fired. None of them moved towards the Imperial fleet. They simply existed, visible, immense, patient. The tactical analysis officer of the Imperial flagship calculated the numbers for 8 minutes before reporting to Grand Warlord Thethys Vor with a voice that had lost all professional intonation. "Grand Warlord, combat simulations indicate an Imperial victory probability of 3.2% in the most optimistic scenario, considering maximum surprise advantage, perfect performance of all ships, and catastrophic failure of enemy systems." Thethys Vor looked at the 116 commanders gathered in the strategy room. He looked at their faces. He saw what he had expected to see. The moment when ideological certainty meets undeniable data, and an intelligent being must choose which survives the encounter. 41 of the 116 already had a different expression than they had when the meeting began. "Does anyone want to make the suggestion we're all thinking?" Thethys Vor said. Silence lasted 13 seconds. Then the commander of the 7th Squadron, a veteran of 60 campaigns whose name translated as "He Who Remains," said, "We should hear what they propose." It was enough. In the communications room, the officer transmitted to the open channel, in Kethara First, a message for Secretary General Amara Osei. "We are ready to hear your full proposal." Amara stood when the message arrived, coffee in hand, eyes on the monitors. She had not slept in 36 hours. There was a note in the corner of the monitor that Lena had placed hours earlier, saying only, "You should rest." She had completely ignored it. She read the message and then said to the entire room, with a voice that revealed none of the 18 months of work, the 60 years of silent construction, the decades of planning that had led to this moment, "Prepare the text of the Liberation Accord." And for the second time in the entire crisis, Secretary General Amara Osei's face displayed a smile. But this time, it was neither small nor imperceptible. The negotiation of the Galactic Liberation Accord lasted 42 Earth days. There was no single physical location where it took place. It occurred simultaneously in cross-transmissions between Bunker Alpha in London, Thetis Vor's flagship stationed in orbit around Uranus after he ordered the Crusade fleet to stop advancing, and Morningstar's gravitational relay points where the Velhari, Chorathi, and Mireth San representatives participated with minimal latency. The Eternal Emperor rejected the first 3 drafts of the Accord. He sent messages to Thetis IV that human interceptors classified as ranging from extremely threatening to philosophically incoherent with any known diplomatic structure. Thetis IV responded to each with the methodical calm of someone who had irreversibly decided that the course was set and that the speed of the journey was the only element still negotiable. In a moment of transparency that surprised Lena Vasilyeva, Thetis Vor transmitted one of the Emperor's messages directly to Amara without additional comment. The Imperial message read, in approximate translation, "You negotiate with vermin. The history of the Empire does not permit retreat." Amara read the text and replied to Thetis Vor, "And what do you think of the Empire's history?" The response arrived 2 hours later. "I think history is written by those who survive to write it. And some stories need to end for others to begin." On the 42nd day, the accord was signed. The terms were structured by Amara, refined by Lena, verified by Dr. Al-Rashid in 3 languages, and ratified by the representatives of each species involved. Humanity had insisted, against the initial objections of some human leaders who wanted more punitive terms, that the accord not be a treaty of capitulation. It was a treaty of transformation. The Empire continued to exist, but within its current borders, without the right to expansion for a period of 200 years, after which a multilateral review would determine the future path. Each previously assimilated system would receive a referendum conducted under independent supervision on its status, voluntary permanence in the Empire, autonomy within a confederation, or total independence. Technological and cultural records destroyed by the assimilation process, to the extent that they could be recovered from imperial archives, would be returned to their species of origin. An independent galactic council, with seats for all signatory species, would be established as a permanent forum for conflict resolution. Humanity refused all imperial territories offered to it as part of the Accord. It refused mineral resources, refused technological concessions, refused any mechanism that would transform Earth into a new galactic power center that others orbited out of necessity. It asked for only one thing on its own behalf: formal recognition that the 14 systems silently colonized over the past 60 years were recognized human territories, not an expansion. The legalization of what already existed. The Velhari representative, during the signing ceremony transmitted to all parties, made the gesture that translators identified as highest honor conferred upon another, a gesture that, as Dr. Al-Rashid would later explain, the Velhari had historically reserved only for leaders of their own species in moments of civilizational significance. He made it towards Amara Osei. Amara nodded formally, and said in phonetic Velhari, 4 months of practice resulting in 6 syllables of approximate acoustic inflection that the communication system amplified to the correct spectrum. We see you. Now the universe sees you too. The Velhari representative was silent for 30 seconds. Then he replied in Keth Ara Fourth, the only verifiable common language between them. We spent 300 years waiting for someone to say that. In the months following the Accord, humanity observed what happened when species that had been suppressed for centuries found they had room to breathe. The Korathi, without the obligation to navigate imperial routes, redesigned the maps of 42 stellar systems using navigation patterns their ancestors had developed before assimilation. Routes that exploited subtle gravitational currents that imperial navigation ignored as inefficient. Journeys that took weeks now took days. The Galactic Council being established immediately adopted Korathi cartography as standard. The Mireth San, freed from the task of maintaining equipment that had never been theirs, returned to what their people had originally done, building infrastructure in extreme environments. In 2 years, they had established the first self-sustaining colonies on high atmospheric pressure worlds that no other known species had managed to permanently inhabit. The Velhari began to terraform. The world in Tau Ceti would take decades to become the ocean they envisioned. But the first cycles of microbial inoculation were carried out with technology that had survived in oral memory for 300 years, passed down from generation to generation by elderly Velhari who never knew if their descendants would have a chance to use it. When the first analysis probes returned with data of positive microbial proliferation, the Velhari representative on the Galactic Council transmitted the news to the human fleet with a message that the translator processed as, "She is remembering how to be an ocean." Amara had retired from the position of Secretary General 3 months after the Accord, passing the role to the Minister of Extra-Systemic Relations, a position that had been specifically created to manage what the world had become. She had returned to Sydney, Australia, where she had been born, and spent mornings walking by the ocean before the day's heat became too intense. It was on one of those mornings, with her toes in the wet sand and the rising sun reflecting on the Pacific, that Lena Vasilyeva found her for the meeting Amara had agreed to have, but had tried to postpone 4 times. "The data is confirmed?" Amara asked, without looking at Lena, her eyes on the horizon. "Confirmed by 4 independent teams over 18 months of analysis." Lena stood beside her. "The structures at the edges of the known galaxy are 40,000 years old. But the new data is the distribution pattern. They are not randomly built structures in different locations. They are distributed in a pattern that corresponds, with 96% statistical precision, to an observation network." "An observation network that spans the entire galaxy," Amara said. "The entire known galaxy, plus a radius that extends beyond it in at least 6 different vectors." Lena paused. "And the signals we detected during the crisis with the Empire, the anomalous frequency emissions that Morningstar's system picked up before it was calibrated, they continue. They were more intense during the Battle of Mars, even more intense during the Accord signing ceremony." Amara stared at the ocean for a long moment. "So we're being watched," she said, "for 40,000 years. At least. And the signal intensity pattern suggests that our period of greatest interest to them was in the last 18 months. Lena opened a file on the device she carried. Dr. Al-Rashid spent the last 4 months trying to identify patterns in the emissions. She found structure. She hasn't been able to translate it yet, but she said it doesn't sound like a language. It sounds more like an evaluation, Amara said. Lena paused. "How do you know?" "Because it's what I would do." Amara finally turned from the water to Lena. "A civilization 40,000 years old that built a galactic observation network would have no interest in any individual species while that species was merely developing. The interest begins when a species does something that indicates what it will become." She looked at the file Lena was holding. Do we want to know what they evaluated? Commander Chen said we should send an exploration probe to the structures as soon as possible, but there's a technical problem. What? The structures are 23,000 light-years away. With our current warp technology, the journey would take 40 years. Amara nodded slowly. Then we'll need better speed. That will take decades of research. Then we start now. Amara took Lena's device and looked at the data of the structures, the points distributed on the galactic map like an artificial constellation, each representing something that had been built when humans still lived in caves. And while we research, what do we do with the fact that someone out there knows we exist? There's a debate about that in the Galactic Council, Lena said. Some want silence. Some want an active contact signal. Amara returned the device. What do you think? Lena considered. I think any civilization that spent 40,000 years observing us without interfering, that remained silent while the Empire existed and while humanity built its fleets in secret, that increased its attention specifically when we resolved a galactic conflict with an accord instead of destruction, has already formed an opinion about us. She paused, and I think sending a signal says less about what we are than what we have already done. They saw what we do. The question is what we do with the fact that they saw. Amara looked at the ocean again. Then she said, Summon Commander Chen. I want a planning meeting by the end of the week. For the expedition? For the expeditions, plural, not just to the ancient structures. She made a vague gesture towards the horizon, which at that moment could have indicated the Pacific or the stars beyond it. We are a young species in a universe much older and more complex than we believed 2 years ago. We were so afraid of being alone that we almost didn't prepare for the opposite. A quiet smile, different from all the previous ones, appeared on her face. It's time to truly leave the solar system. 3 weeks later, the exploration vessel Horizon, equipped with Morningstar's gravitational communication system and a crew of 42 humans, along with 8 Korathi and 4 Mireth-san researchers, left the solar system along the vector pointing towards the ancient structures. Commander Yuki Chen, now Admiral of the expanded Frontier Fleet, watched the departure from an orbital station above Mars and then transmitted a message to the retired Secretary General on Earth. You know that when we find what's out there, it will never be the same again. Amara's response arrived 6 minutes later, in the time it took for the speed of light to travel between the 2 points. Nothing has ever been the same since the day the first human looked up at the sky and wondered what was there. The difference now is that we have enough answers to know that the questions are even bigger. The horizon became smaller in the external camera's field of view until it was no more than a point of light among other points of light, indistinguishable from stars to unaware eyes. And in the depths of interstellar space, in structures that had survived 40 millennia of radiation storms and stellar collapses, the sensors that something had built long before humanity discovered fire registered, for the first time in 40,000 years of silent surveillance, an emission directed specifically towards them. Not a weapon, not an ultimatum, not a declaration of power. A question. The universe, immense and ancient and impossible to be entirely understood by any individual mind, had received many messages over the eons. Species were born, flourished, sent signals, fell silent. Some by conquest, some by exhaustion, some simply because they had found enough answers to stop asking. The human message was different not in what it said, but in how it had arrived. Preceded by 18 months of war and diplomacy and alliance and loss and choice that the observation network had cataloged with the precision of 42,000 sensors distributed throughout the galaxy. The message simply said, "We are here. Who are you?" And somewhere beyond the edge of the known map, in a system that no human astronomer had yet cataloged, Something that had waited 40,000 years for this specific question, asked in this specific way, began to formulate an answer. The giant had awakened. And the galaxy was slowly discovering that the universe was younger than it thought. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more Chronicles of the Galactic Frontier, where each new story explores what makes us human and why it matters to the entire cosmos.